doing a lot of work within IETF and was the security area chair for some time, and now was chairing the OpenPGP working group. And among others, he was writing reflection reports on what we learned from the Snowden revelations, which we found quite interesting, and so we will talk about this. Thank you.
Good morning, just so thanks for being back on time. You're very punctual and correct. Can I just kind of ask how many? I assume probably everybody, given the event, has heard of Edward Snowden. How many people would say you're kind of relatively familiar with the set of Snowden kind of documents? Lots, great. Okay, so I can go over that a bit quicker. I think the last time I gave this talk, it was to a different audience, so there's a bit more of that. And so basically, yeah, it's been like 10 and a bit years, 11 years nearly now, since then. So we thought it would be kind of useful to have somewhat of a look back, and that's what this talk is about. It was actually 10 years since when I first gave this talk, which is at the IETF in July last year. And basically, the independent RFC editor, Elliot Lear, asked a bunch of us to kind of write up some reflections on 10 years past. So I did that as having been the security area director at the time. Faranze kind of wrote a section based on a kind of human rights activist perspective. Bruce wrote a section based on having been somebody who was involved with some of the dealing with the documents at the time. And Steve Belvin kind of wrote a broader kind of look back, also thinking about things like crypto wars previously and so on, that I think Bart's going to talk about later, so we don't need to cover that too much. Anyway, that was documented in an RFC, and we had a talk that's about. So what happened? Again, in 2013, Edward Snowden released a large set of documents. Overall, they didn't really contain that much that was technically new. There were a few things, but not much. Mostly, it showed the scale of the surveillance that the kind of Five Eyes signals intelligence agencies were doing, and that it was much more intrusive. And again, there's a link there for another audience who are less familiar with it. Just to mention a couple of the things that were kind of notable, I guess they had this kind of idea of upstream collection, which was basically examining loads and loads of traffic on various backbone kind of links, sometimes with the collaboration of local operators, and typically involving some kind of filtering. I think the most interesting part of this was really the kind of definitions of what collected meant, that a bunch of the agencies considered that even though they had recorded some bits, they didn't collect them until somebody actually looked at them. That's a kind of, I think that's a counterintuitive kind of idea. But yeah, I think it shows that you need to kind of interpret the statements about what's happening kind of with these kind of subtleties in mind. And I think one other interesting part of this was, if you looked at, I remember looking at one of the documents relating to fiber landings in the UK, and there was an implication in that document, it wasn't directly stated, but there was an implication that for every, let's say, gigabit of bandwidth being landed, something like 10% of that bandwidth was provisioned back to Cheltenham. So the amount of kind of collection was, it looks from those documents, that was based on budgets for various fiber things. It looked like it's substantial. Bull Run, I guess, was another of the programs with lovely code words. And Bull Run was essentially a US government activity, $250 million a year to try and make everything worse. Which is a bit of a pity, kind of a waste of effort. This led to a lot of speculation as to who was acting on whose behalf. Most of that speculation is not really something you can action very well, because it ends up just speculation. However, I guess the Julie C random number generator fiasco seems pretty clearly to have been in the ballpark of this kind of thing. And how many people are familiar with the Julie C thing? Well, not quite as many, so I'll just mention it. Basically, it was a US government standard for random number generation that was broken by the US government without telling the other bit of the US government that they had done this. So NSA presumably had a backdoor into this that resulted in the randomness. Even if you generated 128 random bits, it was probably only 40-something bits of equivalent actual randomness if you knew the backdoor. NIST, on the other hand, standardized this and presumably didn't really know that they were standardizing a backdoor on behalf of another part of their own government. And then there was a really nice set of papers where people did some reverse engineering on IPsec implementations in Juniper that looked like they had been backdoored specifically with this. We got very lucky with ULEC as well, in that somebody, I think it was the US government, basically paid a company $10 million to implement ULEC as the default random number generator in a particular non-open source toolkit at the time. But we got very lucky in that somebody who implemented it in OpenSSL did such a bad job that it was unusable, and so it didn't get used, thankfully. So bad coding sometimes is a good thing. And another one of my kind of favorites from this was the Royal Concierge one. And this was one where GCHQ basically were monitoring some hundreds of hotels or around, looking for keywords around hundreds of hotels, basically trying to pick up the reservation confirmation details for people of interest to them. And presumably the plan was that then they were having monitored these clear text emails and seen a reservation confirmation for somebody at some interesting hotel. They presumably would go and get a room next door or get into that room first or do other things. And I think what that shows is the risk of sending even innocuous things. If you're doing it at scale, then some of the innocuous things you send actually turn out to be sensitive in ways that you probably won't expect. And so I think this is a good justification for when we need to use the argument that somebody says, but you don't need to encrypt this traffic, it's really boring. We don't know. And that's often the case, that we don't know what traffic is boring, what's not. It's all in the eye of the beholder, really. So encrypting, mail transport security is well justified by this kind of thing. And there was the thing called the ANT catalog, which is the kind of James Bond devices, and there's like hundreds of them. Subsequently, Bruce, actually as part of his text in the RFC, is speculating that this wasn't actually released by Snowden, but by somebody else. And I think there's been some other speculation on that in the last year or so. But at the time, when I saw this first, it was news to me. But in any case, it's another NSA document. It describes lots and lots of devices for doing things like keylogging and the equivalent. The one I thought was cuter was this one, which is basically not a keylogger, but a video monitor. And the cute part of this, which was actually not something I had thought of before, was that instead of doing keylogging or recording and then sending the calling home on the internet to send the traffic home, the traffic was actually picked up via radar. So they would shine a radar on these devices from apparently up to 1 kilometer away, and the radar echoes would contain the encoding of the keylogger, which is kind of cute. And I guess it shows you that, assuming that you have an air gap is not necessarily an assumption that's safe in lots of cases, or in some cases. So at the time this was happening, as Andrew said, I was one of the IETF security area directors, and so the IETF basically is the body that defines standards for things like TLS and IPsec and mail and HTTP and so on, a lot of which are security relevant. And I think it's fair to say that people at the IETF meeting that July, it was in Berlin in 2013, they were really pissed off. The level of annoyance was palpable. And it was, as a result, it was great for me as a security area director, because if you're trying to do, it's kind of a middle management thing, if you're trying to get people to do stuff, if they're really annoyed at somebody and you get them to do stuff to kind of satisfy that, they actually do quite a lot. So it was kind of useful that way. But it was definitely palpable, and that was something also that other people, Bruce in particular, he's not somebody who comes to the IETF very often. He came along in November and he noted 10 years later that was something he remembered from it. So the IETF did start to react in 2013. There was a bunch of sort of side meetings. And at the November 2013 IETF in Vancouver, we had a kind of a plenary. One of the IETF plenary sessions are usually incredibly boring administrivia. We had a plenary on this topic that was kind of one of the best attended I've seen in many years. And you can go back and look at the 3-hour video if you like. Apparently it is the most viewed IETF video. Not that means much really, because viewing IETF videos is not great. But basically at that meeting, we kind of got together a bunch of people to say, what can we do to improve the parts of the internet ecosystem where the IETF can help with things? And one of the things that came out of that was have a workshop. This was an IIB W3C sponsored workshop. Mostly those kind of workshops have like 20 people. In this case, we had 150 and we had a waiting list, which is really rare. So it kind of indicates that a lot of people in the internet industry are really annoyed and willing to, in that case, go to London for a few days and try and work on what can we do to improve things. And I think being annoyed kind of helped. So what came out of that activity was a bunch of things, some of which were kind of IETF process things. RC 7258 was one, which I talked about in the next slide. Other things came out, not from the IETF necessarily, but from other parts of the kind of internet industry and academia. Let's Encrypt, for example, started operating in 2015 as a free CA that basically helped to increase the amount of web traffic that was encrypted. And then that also led to defining a new standard for how to do management of public key certificates, particularly in the web, the ACME protocol. And managing those certificates in the web had been a disaster for the previous 2 decades because it was just the protocols we had to find, and partly to blame for that, sorry, were pretty horrible, and there was like 4 different, and each of them was kind of either under-specified or over-specified. Whereas with ACME, I think the kind of lessons that we'd learned kind of landed there. In particular, that when you're doing something like managing certificates or managing any changing piece of data related to security, you need to build in automation from the start. And so with ACME and with Let's Encrypt, they did that mostly and relatively simply by only issuing certificates that last 3 months, which forces you to automate the renewal. And if you automate the renewal, then actually you keep the certificate being valid much more, and you don't run into that problem that we used to have, which was that certificates valid for 18 months are great, except the person who knows how to renew them has moved on to a different job or a different role and forgets how to do it. And so you don't do it and you lose the security. So Let's Encrypt was one of the things that kind of grew out of it. And email transport security, this became more interesting, obviously, as a result of the example I mentioned earlier. And this is not end-to-end email security, because that's hard, but it's just email security between the various servers involved. And prior to Snowden, it hadn't really been, nobody was even measuring how much it was deployed. And later on, as you'll see, the deployment increases significantly. So there's a bunch of activity about further encrypting traffic between email servers in particular, that has had significant success. Generally, for new IETF protocols since then, at least at the application layer, not so much when we talk about the routing layer, because that's much more difficult, but at the application layer, we're basically starting to get to a point where we want to encrypt everything. And that should be a default design for new protocols, that you basically make sure that you don't expose any information to network observers as a baseline. That doesn't solve all problems, but it's a good starting point. Now, it has to be said that security and privacy is not the only motivation for that. One of the other big motivations for wanting to encrypt everything is to stop middle boxes ossifying protocols. So the idea is that if you send traffic in clear, various middle boxes will have a look at that and do something with it, whether it's just logging or measuring or routing or doing something. And those middle boxes don't get updated nearly as often as the endpoints, with the result that you can no longer change your protocol, because every time you try and change, one of these middle boxes breaks. Whereas you avoid that problem if you can encrypt the data, including as many headers as you can. And so some of the reasons why these protocol changes have happened have not been to do with Snowden or with privacy. Some of them are to do with the fact that service providers would like to have better predictability and better control over changes in the end-to-end behavior of the protocols. But still, we get a kind of privacy win out of it, which is good. A notable thing that came out of the Sprint workshop was people started talking about DNS privacy. And prior to that, when DNSSEC was designed, that wonderful success that DNSSEC is, when that was designed 20 odd years ago, it was assumed that because the data in the DNS is public, therefore there was no issue with confidentiality. There was no confidentiality requirement. It turns out that's kind of a bad idea. That's wrong. That the act of accessing data in the DNS is privacy sensitive, and therefore we do want some confidentiality for it. And so we have a bunch of those defined now, including DNS over TLS, or DNS over HTTPS, or DNS over QUIC, or using oblivious DNS over HTTPS. There's a whole bunch of them. And deployment of that is kind of going a little bit slower, but is available, and hopefully will spread more in time. And then also, I think another lesson that the IETF learned was to care more about long-term identifiers. And so you started to see companies and then people working in IEEE and in the IETF as well, instead of having this idea that the MAC address of your Wi-Fi or other radio is hard-coded at manufacturer and is used forever, that you should basically be randomizing these things. And building that assumption into protocol design is something that now should be also kind of a baseline. And there were reasons for this. I think one of the Snowden documents was also talking about the friendly Canadians who were monitoring MAC addresses as people transited through Pearson Airport to Toronto. And then also, I forget where, but somewhere downtown to see which MAC addresses popped up in certain locations downtown Toronto. So the ITF ended up doing a bunch of stuff on all these topics and others, and lots of other internet kind of organizations. Like I said, Let's Encrypt is not an ITF thing. Similarly, there's organizations that you wouldn't expect, like there's a thing called MOG, which I'll be going to their meeting next week. It's an anti-spam organization. In fact, is in that organization that they actually have a kind of semi-closed venue where lots of mail service operators can discuss with each other. And in that kind of venue, actually, it was quite fruitful to have discussions about turning on mail transport security. That some of the operators of large mail services were able to discuss with each other. We turned this on. We didn't see any major downside. Therefore, you can turn it on. And ultimately, pretty much all of the big mail service providers were able to turn on mail transport security, partly as a result of those semi-closed conversations. But I guess with operators, things tend to go that way. And also, as I mentioned, IEEE started looking at MAC address randomization as part of their standards. These things are not always obvious, because with MAC address randomization, you might want to rejoin the same network in a hotel without having to go through the hoops again, or without having to pay again. MAC addresses are also used in some static devices where randomization isn't as useful, etc., etc. So improving these things can take time, it does take time. One of the things I mentioned there is the kind of IETF process discussion, which was about how do we think about the kind of security that we need for our standards. And this paragraph is kind of the core of RC 7258, basically defining what we termed at the time pervasive kind of monitoring. The idea here was that in developing protocols, we'd often think about network attackers, we'd often think about active attacks or passive attacks. It turned out that from the Snowden documents, there was a lot of combinations of things happening, in that there was some upstream collection, perhaps that would be used then to enable the targeting of a particular targeted attack. So I think there was one example in the case of the UK GCHQ attacking Belgacom, a telecoms operator. And one of the things that happened in that attack was they were using this kind of upstream monitoring to look for outbound connections from domestic IP addresses to port 22 in Belgacom infrastructure. And that basically was identifying where the Belgacom system administrators were working from home. And then they would actually mount active attacks directed at people in those homes to try and basically get into Belgacom, to get into, I can't remember what the ultimate target was. I think the ultimate target was actually other bits of NATO, which is kind of fun. But anyway, so the pervasive monitoring is that idea that that kind of monitoring enables a whole bunch of bad things, and therefore the ITF ultimately agreed that we should, when we're developing new things, consider this as an attack. It took about 1,000 emails to get this paragraph agreed, which you can imagine. Some of the issues around that were a bunch of people are happy with certain governments snooping on certain things. But in fact, as we know, you could be happy with your government doing something, but if a technique is available, every other government will want to do it as well. But nonetheless, it did get agreed, and it does get referenced. So if somebody is doing some work in the ITF that would, for example, expose a static identifier in ways that would enable new tracking, I've seen a number of times people would kind of quote this document and say, hey, we should be worrying about this. It doesn't say you have to solve every problem, because you can't solve every problem. It does say you have to consider the attack as one of the kind of panoply of issues when you're designing protocols. Doing that and considering pervasive monitoring I think is a really good idea. But obviously it's not everything. I mean, then if that was all you cared about, then you're still vulnerable to things like spam, malware, DDoS attacks, and so on. And there can be kind of an interesting crossover. So one of the issues that has come up a few times over the years is to do with received header fields in email. And so from one, a receive header field in an email might specify the IP address that was connecting to the next box. And obviously that can have some privacy implications. So we might want to align that to mask out some part of the IP address, etc., for privacy reasons. On the other hand, people also make the correct argument that those IP addresses are also used in classifying various types of bad email. It may be spam, maybe containing malware and so on. Because if you see a lot of email, you will see a bunch of senders from certain IPs where the probability of it being bad email is higher. So if you mask those IP addresses, you also hurt privacy in that you make it more likely that some people will fall victim to phishing attacks. So the balance here can be quite subtle, and it's not always the case that we can just kind of throw away something that has a privacy leak, because we might cause a worse privacy problem elsewhere by doing that. So these things can be a little bit subtle. But nonetheless, I think it's a good hypothesis to say we should kind of work on countering pervasive monitoring, because it'll get us to thinking about the right kind of protocol mechanisms and implementation details, and we'll kind of we'll get improvements. We won't necessarily get perfection. And there's also, of course, again, part of the discussion of the 1,000 emails, there's always a kind of a tension between people who want to make protocols and implementations and networks and more secure and more privacy friendly, and there's a tension there with people who also want to manage these networks and outcome services. In that, people who manage networks and services, they like to know what's going on. They will want to be able to look back at, let's say, DHCP logs in order to see who was connecting to a network at the time of an incident. But on the other hand, we don't want them to keep DHCP logs forever, because those logs can have privacy-sensitive information like hosted names. So that kind of tension and trade-off is acknowledged in the RFC, and it always leads to debates. So it happens over and over, and typically the most common thing you see is that somebody turns up and says, oh, I'd like to man in the middle TLS and make that a standard because of my enterprise policy, blah, blah, blah. And this happens over and over again. It won't stop happening. It will keep happening, because there is just a tension between people who would like to be able to manage networks to see what's going on and people who would like to preserve privacy. And you can't kind of get rid of that tension. You have to kind of try and manage it and produce good arguments as to why we should be doing the more privacy-friendly things. Yeah, so I think that's just a tension. Now, I think half of the people, I don't know if it's half, but maybe let's say half of the people who kind of object to when we try to turn on encryption for some new thing, maybe half of them are kind of from this camp of people saying it's life harder to run networks. Typically, what I've seen is that they're genuinely saying that, they're not saying anything false, but they figure out other ways to deal with the new encryption later on. I was at one meeting in this time frame with a mobile network operator who literally was banging the table, saying that if you start encrypting YouTube, and I wasn't encrypting YouTube, if somebody starts encrypting YouTube, then his mobile network, radio access network, would go to hell, because at that time they were treating video differently from non-video on their network, and by looking into the data. And so YouTube got encrypted, their network didn't fall over because you can kind of tell it's video because it's so big. So they found other ways of doing it. Now, that's not trivial for them, because as a network operator, they had probably invested in spending CapEx on buying equipment that would decide which traffic is video and how to deal with that. So, it was an issue for them. They were annoyed. They got over it. That's maybe half of the people. Another half of the people tend to be those for whom they'll never be happy. They basically always think that I want to be able to snoop on everybody just in case. So secure requests and so on. The kind of people who will always have the plan in the bottom drawer for whenever an incident happens, that's some terrorist-related incident or some CSAM-related news story gets traction, they'll pull out their plan as to why we should be not encrypting things or breaking the encryption. Those kind of people do exist, and they'll never go away also, so they will keep having these plans in the bottom drawer and pulling them out, and we will have to keep arguing against them, as I think the first talk this morning indicates. However, I think they've lost the game there, really. I think there's so much that would be at risk if we stopped encrypting things properly, that I think ultimately that argument that we need to be able to have visibility on everything is a losing argument. Personally, I think that's the case, but it'll keep going. So, coming on to the specific document, RC 9446 is the document we wrote about the 10-year kind of look back. It's basically 4 essays. And the idea of writing it was basically as a way to encourage other people in the IGF community, or more broadly like yourselves here, to kind of think back on what have we done since then, what could we still be doing, what's yet to be done, we still could be improving, and how should we do that? So like I say, it's 4 essays. Mostly I talk about IETF stuff. Forensic considers human rights impacts. Steve talks about the evolution of things. And Bruce talks about what happened at the time. So I've got a slide on each. But first, I think we can kind of, part of the look back, we can kind of look at what's happened since. And there's kind of good news. So the good news on the web, for example, this is how much web traffic is encrypted from the point of view of Firefox over the decade. And you can see it goes from about 30% back when, I'm sure you remember, when we were doing things like just only the login page was encrypted to port 80. That was common, but nowadays we can see that we've kind of got a really good increase over a number of years. It seems to have plateaued somewhere now, but it's plateaued at a pretty high level. I mean, it's an interesting question: is how could you get that to 100%, or closer to 100%? I think there's scope for work there, even in the web, where the default nowadays is pretty much encrypting everything. If you look at mail transport, again, I think there's some really good news there. These kind of numbers only started in 2014, because like I said, in 2013, when we went asking people how many of you are encrypting your mail server-to-server traffic, most people didn't know, and nobody was measuring. So people started measuring, and then various services start turning on mail transport security, and you can see the nature of the thing is, with these kind of large jumps up, that's because of the nature of email these days. It's so dominated by some of the large mail providers. But again, this is from the Google point of view, and I'm not wearing my glasses, so I think it says inbound. So it's kind of inbound mail. So that's how many mails arriving at Gmail servers are arriving over secure transport. And again, it kind of gets very high. I don't know what the wiggling around in recent years is about. Again, there's kind of scope there for interesting work to try and to dive deeper into this. Because I think to some extent, the impetus for doing this that was there in 2013 has dissipated. So we've kind of, if we want to get this kind of 90-odd% up to even closer to 100, people will have to kind of go and start looking at it and doing new work, which is doable. MAC address randomization, I think, also has some good news, but a slightly different pattern. Is because of the kind of the rollout of new handheld, mostly mobile phones, and the way that's kind of staggered in versions and over-the-air updates versus not getting those, and also the MAC address randomization schemes have changed over time. But we can see a kind of a gradual, chunky improvement in the number of times that we're using a random MAC address versus the number of times we're using a static one. And again, if you look at Canary logs, or you just look at your Wi-Fi routers, you can kind of see this pretty clearly. There are still some kind of exceptions. I'm not sure if this has gone away or not, but I do this in class every year with the class to kind of put up an access point and see which MAC addresses are randomized and which are not. Until recently, there was a case that if you Apple, for example, if you buy a new iPhone, you can very easily transit from your old iPhone. You move all your stuff, right? And apparently until very recently, and maybe this is fixed or not, I don't know, one of the things that would be moved across would be the hostname, as used in DHCP. So you would in your DHCP log see things like, Werner's iPhone, and that somebody named Werner had to put their name in as the name of their iPhone 10 or 15 years ago. And it would still be percolating through into DHCP logs today. So but nonetheless, there are things that are kind of improving in that space as well. Less or sort of middling news is to do with DNS privacy. We haven't seen a gigantic deployment of DNS privacy so far. It's not trivial, it's not nothing. It's maybe hitting around 20%, but still it could be doing a lot better. Some of the barriers to this were, again, the typical issues when Firefox, for example, a number of years ago announced that they were going to turn on DNS over HTTPS as a default, and a bunch of mobile operators and other ISPs, not just mobile, objected to this because they were using the DNS traffic from their customers for various purposes. Now, some of those purposes may be valid and good network management things to do, like trying to kind of give non-answers or tell DNS lies if somebody is trying to contact a known phishing site. That's probably a reasonably safe thing to do. On the other hand, others were probably selling that data. So there's quite a fuss over that. So we haven't got to the point where DNS privacy is ubiquitous. It's deployed. So if you're running any Android device, you can turn on DNS over TLS. Unfortunately, you see port blocking because that uses port 853 instead of 53. But it won't work in enough networks that causes enough impedance that not many people will turn it by default, turn it on by default. And the mobile operators that they distribute handsets can't enable it as a default as well. So there's some issues here to figure out, but it's a newer thing, I guess, as well. It's kind of fair to say. However, the protocol work is kind of done. Figuring out how to get that deployment up to bigger numbers is a challenge that's worth working on, and hopefully people will see improvements there in the future. And just to reiterate, the sensitivity of this is significant because if you're accessing a local Alcoholics Anonymous website or something, that's visible in your DNS traffic, and so the impact here is there's a real privacy win here if we can get better deployment of better use of this technology that is deployed in the endpoints. So just back to the document quickly. Some points Bruce made, as I said, I thought were interesting. So the first one was maybe the ANT catalog wasn't actually a Snowden document, but it came from a different party, which is kind of interesting. I think a good point that Bruce makes is that everything we learned 10 years ago is well out of date. The adversary here is not stupid, and we're very well resourced. So they're definitely doing other things. So for example, I would imagine, and I think this has been demonstrated in public these days, is that they will buy data from commercial data brokers. So a lot of the commercial snooping that happens for advertising is directly, in my opinion, feeding into exactly the same type of surveillance, either because people who claim to be advertising entities are actually surveillance entities, because anybody can bidding wars, anybody can make a bid, right? So the bidders some of those will be associated with signals intelligence agencies and know how to try to send it out. So we've just seen that the buying data for commercial data brokers is absolutely a thing that at least in the US happens. I'm sure it happens elsewhere as well. And there's probably lots of other things that we haven't thought of. We should be thinking about new ways in which the bad actors here might be acting against our interests as well. Bruce noted that everybody was pissed off. And he also noted that despite a lot of the stuff in the press at the time and since, and despite a lot of activity, the attitude of the various governments, particularly the US government, doesn't seem to have changed very much. Basically, I think maybe I've said these things already. I guess the point I'd call out here is that RC 7258, the basic thing that says we should worry about pervasive monitoring, it nowhere mentions governments, really. It doesn't say only governments. If you read that RFC, it also applies just as much to commercial entities like advertisers. However, we haven't seen nearly as much activity in that space. And I think partly as a result of that, I think the internet is way worse than it was 10 years ago in many respects. And that has prompted regulators to start kind of doing reasonable kind of things about the various European regulations about digital services and so on. However, some of those regulations, maybe if they're even the ones that are very well intended, they may actually stymie the kind of permissionless innovation that led to the internet being such a useful thing for everybody. So on the internet, basically, anybody can write a program, anybody can put up a server, anybody can operate a service. If you start having to introduce regulation because of the misbehaving advertising industry, then that will make permissionless innovation harder in various ways. So either for open source projects or just for people who want to operate services, that they'll fall under NIS2 for some reason that doesn't quite make sense because they're a tiny provider or something like that. Also, I think we should think more about the ethics of what we're doing, which is kind of a bit of a hard sell when you're talking to US corporations. But nonetheless, I think we should be thinking about the ethics of what we're doing, not as companies, but as individual engineers. Because personally, I don't think it's kind of okay. I mean, I know a lot of engineers who work for the likes of Google or Amazon and some of these large companies who are very ethical people. But collectively, I question whether they're actually acting ethically as a group. I think they should question that more themselves. Franze, as a human rights kind of person, basically points out that it's really hard to make any empirical measurement of what's happened here and the effect of exposing it. But it would be kind of interesting to try. It's not my kind of area of expertise, so I think it's an interesting point, though, is how can you measure the impact of these kind of revelations? We can kind of measure the amount of mail transport security that's deployed, that we can measure. How can we measure, though, the impact of making people are snooping like they have been? That's kind of a tricky question, but interesting. She said we also, we as the engineers developing internet protocols and code, we tend to forget about human rights all the time. She mentioned the point about ORDAP, which I think is a great point, but not particularly relevant. And then also she starts arguing that we should do impact assessments of protocols. Basically, and again, I think Bart will talk about the crypto wars a bit later, but Steve basically points out that governments will always try to break your security because they always have some part of their government that wants to know everything, just in case, and spies are going to spy, basically. And even if, I think we saw in the last talk, you can't have really crap crypto, but even if you have good crypto, they'll find a way to work around it. But we still need that baseline of good crypto and not the kind of crap stuff that we saw discussed there in the last talk. We also need to care, this is more for an ITF kind of audience where we're talking about how do you define protocols and so on. We need to care more about how implementations work and what they do. And for example, be worried more about things like ransomware. That doesn't really get considered in an ITF context because it's not kind of part of the network, but arguably it should be because it's such a big problem. And definitely we should worry more about metadata. I think this is something that's actually has improved in the time frame concerned, in that if you look at the Quick protocol as a transport protocol, it's encrypting an awful lot of headers that used to be clear in TCP. And I think that, we're trying to do better on metadata and have had some wins there. So that work, a lot of that work has happened in various ways in the ITF and in the broader internet community. There's more going on. So we're looking at encrypted client hello is a thing that I happen to be writing code for. The idea here is even with one of the outcomes of Snowden was TLS version 1.3. I think that was a big win over earlier versions of TLS for a number of reasons. One is that we, again, protect more of the metadata, so certificates from the servers are already sent to an encrypted channel as compared to TLS 1.2. We have formal methods, proofs of various of the security properties of the TLS 1.3 protocol, and we waited for those whilst developing the protocol. I think that was a good process kind of win. Not entirely motivated by Snowden, but to a large degree. However, with TLS 1.3, you still expose the server name indication in the client hello message, which still gives away the game to the network observer as to which website of the perhaps 1 million that are hosted by Cloudflare, which of those ones do you want to talk to? So there was no real point in trying to address this in TLS 1.3 because we didn't have DNS privacy. You've already told the DNS who you want to talk to. Now that we have DNS privacy, we're working on how to encrypt that last bit of significant plain text in the TLS handshake. And there's a thing called encrypted client hello. It kind of works, it's not deployed yet, but hopefully it'll get deployed. People are working at a lot of kind of hybrid post-quantum crypto stuff, and again, there's a talk later on this. Some of that effort, in my personal opinion, is misdirected and utterly kind of a waste of time to do with hybrid signatures in particular. Other parts of it to do with record now, decrypt later attacks is very important and really needs to be kind of moved as fast as possible. There's various oblivious protocols. There's an interesting new IETF working group on privacy preserving metrics, which is trying to allow things like browser makers to find out how many people click a particular button in their user interface without ever knowing how any individual measurement was made. So they're kind of using kind of useful kind of new cryptographic mechanisms to be able to get these kind of things. So I think this is all kind of good stuff. We still haven't made much progress on countering traffic analysis. In most cases, people, at least in closed world experiments, can basically tell from traffic analysis perhaps which website you're talking to or which landing page you've hit. And I think we need to do more to protect against that. We've done some, so new protocols in the IETF tend to allow for new kinds of padding at various levels. So TLS 1.3, for example, is relatively good at this. However, the deployed instances are probably still vulnerable to traffic analysis in lots of cases. And as I said earlier, there was this palpable annoyance, which helps a lot as an area director of the IETF to get people to do new stuff or to improve things, and that's dissipated. It's just not the same as it was 10 years ago. And also, I think it's also entirely true that at least the IETF community, which tends to come from large vendors, from academia and from operators and so on, that annoyance having dissipated, it's obvious that internet engineers they found it much easier to work against the adversary of Signal as a signals intelligence agency than to work against the adversary who's the advertising companies who are usually their employers. That's just a fact. I think it's harder to get them to do stuff. However, it seems to me that it seems to be pretty obvious that the real-time bidding advertising model is just as bad or worse than the pervasive monitoring that Snowden kind of told us about 10 years ago. It's much more intrusive. It's happening in billions of times a day. However, it's hard to get internet engineers to work as much and as thoroughly and with as much effort against that, because that's where their money's coming from, sadly. And I think the result is that the internet is worse than it was. I don't know what we can do about that. Maybe you guys could do more, but I think it'd be good to have ideas about how we could incent people to consider the advertising business model as the same kind of adversary as signals intelligence agencies. So how bad does it get? It gets pretty awful. So regardless of whatever you think about abortion, having Google Pixels on the web pages that tell you how to get to an abortion clinic or healthcare provider or something like that just seems utterly unacceptable. I think it's also true that at least the web and mobile app ecosystems have utterly forgotten this. So if people want to do kind of little projects highlighting these things, there's a fantastic one anyone anywhere can do is pick a segment, some healthcare providers in your local region, go and troll their websites, see how many of them are including Google Analytics or Facebook Pixels on web pages where they should be telling nobody that you're accessing this web page. And it seems that every time somebody does that study, a high 90% of instances are found where healthcare providers, or whichever segment you pick, are essentially ratting you out to the advertising industry, the fact that you've looked at a particular page, and then that's going to be updated in a profile of interests or whatever. And it's all in all pretty horrible. Conclusions then. So Snowden's revelations, I think that was a big deal. It did lead to significant change in what was deployed on the internet, things like the web and being encrypted, mail transport security, in how we develop internet protocols, and we're not done. That work is continuing. Sadly, you have to apologize for the internet now, which wasn't the case 20 years ago. And I think it'd be good if we reflect on all that. So I think the main takeaway for an ITF audience, and perhaps for ourselves, is we should think about this pervasive monitoring attack and how it applies to commercial entities and act to counter it just as much as we did 10 years ago when we were thinking about the Five Eyes agencies. That's it, thank you, and I don't know if we have time for questions.
I think we have a moment for at least 1 or 2 questions while the next speaker is setting up.
I have a question. You said that DNS Farrell was being sold. Is this true for Europe as well? Do you know any European resolver provider that actually sells this data?
So yes, well, remotely, the question was that DNS data being sold for commercial reasons, and do I know of any cases that's happened in Europe? I do not. The only cases I know of are US.
Okay, so this is a US problem really that we're solving.
I think it's a DNS problem. Well, no, I mean, the situation with respect to DNS operators in Europe could change, or people may be using DNS operators that are not in Europe, from Europe.
Actually, you make a very good point, because people using DOH are shifting from a European provider, user operating resolver protected by the GDPR, to a resolver operating in the US, not operating under the GDPR. So actually, for Europeans, DOH is a negative outcome.
I don't agree with that conclusion. There are the DNS recursive resolve, public recursives operated in Europe according to GDPR. They're just as easily picked. And if you look, for example, Firefox have done a bunch of work with what they call trusted recursive resolvers to try and ensure that no bad things happen with your DNS data if you're using Firefox with one of their approved built-in recursive resolvers. So I don't think it's correct to say that if you send your DNS traffic to the US, it gets sold. I think it is correct to say it's a DNS privacy is a DNS problem and not a regional problem.
Thank you. I would just like to add before my question that for Europe there is Code9, which as far as I know has this company, so maybe you can look into that. But my question is more about the email, which is a pain point for privacy, because most people don't use PGP or Slime, and at the same time we transition to using those services. So even if some of us decide to have a strong email server, we are mostly communicating with people that employing also than Microsoft or Google, which are US-based companies. And so at the same time, if you decide to change the protocol, you are breaking one of the oldest protocols of the internet, so you have backward compatibility problems. So again, my question is, do you think that we can solve this issue from a technical perspective, or that maybe we should look for a political solution so that the European Union invests more in adding European cloud service providers?
So I think that was more than one question. What I heard were two questions at least. One is a solution to end-to-end email security more technical or political? And the second question I thought was, what do we think about the fact that email is so concentrated in large providers who happen to be American companies now? On the second question, I think the centralization of email, I think, is doing us a disservice, but it's economically inevitable. It just turns out to be that I can operate my own mail server. For my university, for our department of computer science, we changed from self-hosted mail to Microsoft. That's crap, sorry. But we couldn't hang on to the sysadmins. They can just get a better paid job elsewhere, and you can't. It was just too hard to keep a university sysadmins running mail services, and for a whole bunch of reasons, we ended up transitioning to a large provider, and I think that has downsides whether that's European or not. And on your first question, I think the main barriers to end-to-end email security are technical before we get to the political. I can give you a whole hour about why PGP or S-MIME deployment is so small, but I guess we don't have time, but I'm happy to talk about it later. But I think they're mainly technical and not political.
Today I want to present to you, I guess, a modest result, which I hope to get more in the limelight of key exchange in total. About privacy-preserving authenticated key exchange. And I'm going to talk about its application to the key exchange protocol of IPsec. So originally this has been published at PKC 20, but I think there could be more attention at this. Okay, good. So let me start by giving you an intuition of what key exchange actually is. So we have this beautiful result that ultimately led to the Turing Award for Diffie Hellman. Beautiful result where we wanted to have that Alex and Bob do share a symmetric tree where they can use that key to quickly secure their messages with. But in a lot of scenarios, like for example, online shops, we don't have that. So there must be a mechanism such that over some insecure channel, Alex and Bob can come to a situation where they have a key. And this mechanism is called authenticated key exchange. So, classically, we have that this works with public key cryptography. So this means that when a bot enters the system, registers, he generates the secret key that is to be kept secret with him only, and also a public key, although they are public key bot, that can be shared with everyone. Of course, this only makes sense if we can't compute the secret key from the public key, but otherwise, this works quite fine in practice. And Alice does the same. She generates a secret key to be kept secret by herself, and a public key to give to everyone. And in general, these protocols, they have some amount of moves, few moves. In practice, usually it's 2 or 3 moves. And at the end of those protocols, indeed, Alice and Bob share a common symmetric key, and the intuition is that, well, no one else does know that key. Okay, so now let's see how these kind of protocols will be used in the network. So observe first that There in the network, there might be several parties, P1, P2, and Pn, not only L4, of course. And to each of those parties, we associate now a secret key, SK1 to party P1, and SK2 to party 2. And all the other public keys of all the other parties are publicly known, so everyone knows. Now, what these protocols for higher security offer is that now, whenever we run that protocol, we will generate a new symmetric key. Okay? And this is and to express that nicely, we say that the protocol runs, they represent sessions. So whenever we run that protocol, we have a different session. And as you can see now here, for example, for party PM, there are different sessions, and each of those sessions, they will result in a different shared key result. Okay? And we can think of maybe, in this case, PM sharing a key with P1. However, like we need to be a little bit more precise, and this is going to be session 1 that is working together with session N2. But importantly, that there's like long-term information that is associated to the party, which is the long-term secret key, and session-dependent information as well. Okay, and of course, like in a network with high volumes, there can be a lot of sessions. Okay, now let me give you an intuition for what security is meant to be. Okay, so the idea is now that we would love to have a protocol that is super secure. Okay? And super secure means, well, in some sense, against an adversary that is allowed to reveal a lot of secrets. And this adversary here, in particular, is allowed to specifically ask for session keys of other sessions. So you may ask for this session 1.1, I would like to see the session. Okay? And this adversary may also ask under certain conditions for secret key. Now the idea is, well, unless it represents some kind of trigger attack, all this revealing and opening of secrets shouldn't influence the security of other sessions. So what one essentially tries to do here is kind of to say, well, even though everybody has a run all the other sessions, corrupting left and right, for those specific parts that you didn't get, security should still. So, and we usually express that when we are more formal. We express that by allowing, first of all, the adversary to send data, so this kind of model, so the adversary is very active. We can control the network in some sense. The adversary is allowed, as I said, to corrupt parties, to obtain secret keys. It may also reveal keys of certain sessions. And then there finally is now the intuition of what it actually means for an adversary to win at all. And this is given by now a procedure that is associated with something that is called a test group. And what happens now is the adversary can choose one of those uncorrupted and unrevealed sessions, like session 1 or 2. And be given some challenge, some candidate key. Okay, and this key is either the real key that is used at that session, or it's truly random. Okay, and that is particularly useful. And we say that this kind of protocol is secure if no adversary can distinguish whether the actual key has been used or random. That is quite neat, because this means ultimately that we can plug in symmetric key cryptography like this. Okay, so, but like, already there are a lot of details. The intuition is that although the adversary can reveal something from other sessions, from other parties, well, security should hold for those that so far have been not revealed, not corrupt. Okay, good. Now let's go back a little bit. So this is the classical setup, and most literature is actually
Go a bit closer to the laptop so that the screen moves.
and most literature actually covers this setting here. Okay. And now sometimes in certain scenarios the setting is a little bit different. Okay? For example, in the setting of multi-home servers, where we have one machine, and on that machine we have maybe several virtual machines running. And each virtual machine now has a secret key on its own. Right? And now in this case, Alice has both the public keys of Bob, 0 and 1, and could try to speak to any of those virtual servers. And in the general case, it goes in both directions. Alice can also have several identities, several public keys. And yeah, Bob could also try to talk to Alice and address specifically one public key of her, to talk to some underlying virtual machine. And it turns out like this hasn't necessarily, needn't will necessarily be a machine and a physical server and virtual servers running on it, but it can also be some network interface, such that behind that interface there are several identities that could be used, different public keys, but for our setting, it's hard for the adversary to kind of see which one exactly is going to be used. Okay. So, to clarify, what this tries to model is not anonymity or privacy within the network. So what this tries to model is that we have several endpoints, somehow endpoints, network interfaces, that an adversary that is located in a public network can reach and access. But behind those points, somehow, there's also different identities. Okay? So why is this important? So it's important to consider because there could be a benefit to hide which of those parties that Alice tries to communicate with, located at Bob, is actually the communication partner. Think of maybe a politically active small server that is located beside some larger commercial server. And it would be awesome from a privacy point of view if it would be indistinguishable if someone was actually talking to now this political website or if it's actually talking to the commercial website. So there's now room to think about privacy. Okay, well, an application that we can think of here is filtering based on SNI, where for one IP address in TLS, we have different servers, and when we want to talk to them, then we have to address which server exactly we want to talk to. And accordingly, the key material will be chosen. Okay, so, and indeed in TLS there's like some progress on the way. There's now encrypted SNIs or encrypted client hellos in general that help to avoid these kind of SNI filtering their mechanisms. There have been major like upsets in South Korea and also in India, where it has become public that the government there is trying to censor according to, let's say, this the SNI field. So to circumvent that in general, like whatever the mechanism is, we would like to have some privacy. Okay? Good. And again, let me be clear, this is no substitution for Tor. Tor is a way to increase privacy in the network. Okay, so this is kind of making it indistinguishable which whom exactly behind the network node we are talking. Okay. So what I would like to do in the rest of this talk is to talk a little bit about like what we would like to have and maybe how to formalize that. And then I will give an outlook showing that surprisingly, the handshake mechanism of IPsec does have such a privacy property. Okay, so like how can we even formalize that? So essentially what we want to do is we want to have, besides this key indistinguishability, where the final symmetric key is indistinguishable from a random key, we want something similar for identities. So we want that if identity A is used, then this should be indistinguishable to any adversary from the situation where the second identity is used. Okay, and what we also would like to have actually is that this is like indeed a proper extension of that old one, of the old notion, of the old intuition of what security is meant to be. Good. Okay, so it turns out that modeling this is a little tricky. And on the way of coming up with a good solution for this, we also need to introduce something that is pretty new, that is called modes. And in general, you can think of this to be a way to deal with protocol options in security proofs and cryptographic proofs. Okay, I guess this is also very interesting for dealing with options in much more general. Okay. So first of all, observe that there is somehow like a generic weakness. Okay, so let me sketch first like a way to get maybe as much privacy as possible, and then also kind of sketch why we still achieve something a little bit modest. Okay, so what we could do now is, so we could have a key agreement here. If we have a key agreement that is entirely independent of any identity, okay, just like fresh values, no authentication whatsoever. Then we use that key and start to encrypt already. Okay, so we derive some symmetric key, and now from now on, the entire communication is entirely encrypted symmetrically. Okay, and only at that point we will reveal the identities to each other. Okay, now. And we can think of maybe here being the authentication token, like a signature scheme, or like a MAC that helps to authenticate if the claim that the initiator is indeed the initiator is actually true. So like some kind of to prove identities, some kind of mechanism to prove identities. Okay. Now, what is the problem with this? The problem with this is, well, the entire first part now is totally unauthenticated. So an adversary could just slip in between those two and make generically make a man-in-the-middle attack. Okay? And then we would be at this point entirely, right? So the adversary could choose, let's say, G to the 1 and just claim to be Alice for now. Then they would both derive a key K, Sure. And then the adversary would see the first message, and it would be able to decrypt that message and see the identity. However, the intuition now is that, well, this is a problem for sure, but at this point in time, the adversary should be unable to come up with the authentication token. So we would assume that, we would hope that at this point in time, the responder will abort. So from that point of view, it seems that this is the best we can do. Okay? So yes, we have, we can manage to get this identity protection, but only under the condition that everything works well. Like everything has to work well, and both parties don't have to, must not abort. This is this seems a little odd, but it's very similar to classical key exchange as well, where the key that we want to use is only good if none of the parties has actually aborted at some point before. Okay. So, but this is a little bit a caveat here, and it seems to be a very fundamental problem. Okay, good. Now, so I'm going to sketch a little bit how we need to add now this running of protocols to account for these kind of identities, for multiple identities, and to formulate what it means to have a secure security against those kind of privacy attacks. So what we do now is we add some session-specific information. And the session-specific information is, first of all, consistent of so-called public modes and private selector bits. So for the public modes, what they say is that, well, the session that holds this mode is a session with a specific expectation of who is choosing identities. Okay, so maybe maybe these two values identify that the expectation of that session is that itself is going to choose its identity at will, either the first or the second. But maybe it also says that it is under the expectation that it's going to be responsible for choosing the identity of the communication partner. Okay, and now by making these information public, adversaries get very strong. They know, well, that guy tries to specify the identity of, let's say, Bob, but Bob wants to specify that identity himself. So let's try to clash those guys and make them run together. Okay, and then there are indeed the identities that are actually used by those parties. So for the first party, for Alice, there is an identity selector bit, ISB. And this basically says, well, I'm going to use this secret key in that communication. And that is information that is session specific. And that makes sense to do it, because in some other session it might change. Maybe sometimes Alice is going to choose the identity and certain kind of variants of the protocol, and sometimes it's going to be someone else. The important thing why we should model that is that in all those cases, we use the same long-term keys. So it wouldn't suffice just to think of different variants of the protocol. If we use the same protocol, then maybe a tricky way to kind of change those modes or change those identity selector bits would increase the chances for some attacker to break the system. Good. Now, and besides those queries that you have seen before, those four on the bottom, we would now add something additionally. We would now try to formalize what it means to be indistinguishable in terms of identities. And for that, we would allow the adversary, as before, to unmask unrelated sessions. Right? or to maybe unmask the bit of the partner. So saying that like this session is knowing which identity exactly the partner is using, and we might ask this one to reveal it. Okay. Of course, we need to carefully like rule out trivial attacks here again, sure. But we also kind of increase accordingly the winning conditions of the adversary. So what we now want is that the adversary can do either. We want to have that, even if identities are revealed, right? Because, I mean, identities may be revealed much more easily via metadata or via some other channels. So even if that happens, like the old security norm should not be violated. So we want to strictly improve it. However, we also would like to have the other way around. Even if the key, which is just like a high entropy bit string, is revealed, then this should not give anything about the identities used. So again, going for high independence between certain values, although they work together in these computations. Okay, so why I think this is super useful is that is basically a general plugin for classical security. So you can not only add this scenario to what I've just shown you to apply it to IPsec, but I guess there are a lot of models in key exchange that you could augment with these kind of considerations. You could take them and also make them aware of privacy guarantees. Okay, now let's quickly look at IPsec. In IPsec, we kind of identify as those network interfaces, the network ways. So we can think of those guys as high internal identities. And then thirdly, that is located in between those gateways just only sees those endpoints. But behind those endpoints, there's like identities. And now let's quickly go through this protocol. And importantly, I want to show to you that indeed there is an option in that protocol and a way to specify for someone else the identity to be used. Okay, so first of all, you know all of this except for maybe G to the X and G to the Y. And we can think of now, well, there's again some kind of key with G to the XY, so it's solidity element-based key exchange. Now with some additional randomness. But in general, it's just a different key exchange. And we get from the new key S. And from that key S, we get all the symmetric keys that we need to use in the later stage. And as before, in the generic outline, we will now use those keys to encrypt and authenticate the entire communication so far. And as we have seen in this generic template, we will have to authenticate at some point. Okay, so I like to point to three different parts. So first of all, importantly, there's this yellow part, which says IDR. This is an option. And essentially this says, if the field is present, then the initiator specifies which identity of the responder is to be used. Right? So it makes sense to care about the expectation of who is going to have to choose identities. And now it's actually the initiator that chooses the identity of the responder. Okay, and if the identity field's IDR is not present, then it's just the responder that's choosing. Okay. Second, for authentication, we use signatures, and everything will be encrypted, and as a consequence of that, those signatures better be equal size. Okay? If they're not equal size, then maybe the symmetric encryption scheme has different sizes, and this would reveal information. So it's very important now to use signatures that have the same size. And also what's kind of interesting to us is that there's also now this PIF3 that outputs kind of MAC values, TI and TI. And it seems those values don't add to the security at all. So I'm not sure about the historic reason, but for provable security, they are basically not really useful. Okay, now it seems that there's like these, as typical in crypto, there's provable crypto, there's like theorems that says like under some reasonable assumptions, then IPsec does indeed provide that strong property. Also, this form of identity hiding. It means that we will just an attacker in that mode will not see if like which identity is used. Okay, so I think these things can generically be put in a lot of places, and I think it could help in a lot of sub-niche fields of authenticated key exchange as well. I think it's a testament that this actually applies to IPsec, also to the successful design of IPsec, but also to the validity of these kinds of considerations at all in terms of privacy. Okay, so that's all. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. I think we're 5 minutes over time for lunch, so we take the questions offline and then people have lunch. It will be